For thousands of years, one name has quietly appeared again and again in the pages of ancient scripture. A kingdom rising in the east, a powerful empire influencing the fate of nations, a land that sometimes stands as a protector and other times as a warning. Today, we know that land by a different name, Iran. In the modern world, Iran is often discussed in terms of geopolitics, nuclear negotiations, military alliances, and regional tensions. News headlines speak about missile programs, proxy conflicts, and diplomatic standoffs. But long before modern borders existed, long before the Middle East looked the way it does today, the ancient texts of the Bible were already mentioning a powerful Eastern nation connected to many of the turning points of history. Now, before we continue, it's important to understand something. This is not a video about politics, and it is not about blaming or attacking any nation or people. Instead, this is about exploring a fascinating historical question. Why does the Bible mention Persia so many times? And what role did that ancient empire play in the story of the world? Because when we begin to connect the historical timeline, something remarkable begins to appear. From the very beginning of recorded biblical history, to the rise and fall of ancient empires, to the birth of Jesus himself, Persia appears again and again in surprising ways, sometimes as a rival, sometimes as a protector, and sometimes as an unexpected instrument in events that changed the course of human history. And to understand that story, we have to travel all the way back to the very beginning, back to a time just after one of the most dramatic moments described in the Bible, the flood. According to the book of Genesis, after the waters receded, humanity began again through the family of one man, Noah. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. From these 3 family lines, entire civilizations eventually emerged across the ancient world. And hidden within those early genealogies are 2 names that historians and biblical scholars often connect to the lands that would later become part of the Persian world: Elam and Madai. At first glance, they may seem like small details in a long list of ancient names, but over time, those names would become the roots of powerful civilizations. Elam developed into one of the oldest kingdoms in the ancient Near East, located in the region that corresponds to parts of modern southwestern Iran. Meanwhile, the descendants of Madai are often linked to the Medes, an influential people who settled in the mountainous regions further north. For centuries, these cultures grew and evolved. Cities were built, trade routes expanded, kingdoms rose and fell, and eventually, these early civilizations would become part of something far greater, an empire that would one day stretch across 3 continents. But before Persia became a superpower, before its kings ruled vast territories, the Bible records an early moment that set the stage for one of the first conflicts ever described in Scripture. The story appears in the book of Genesis. It describes a conflict between several kings in the ancient world, a coalition of powerful rulers from the east who launched a campaign across the region of Canaan. Among those eastern rulers was a king associated with Elam. Their armies moved through cities, defeating local rulers and taking captives. One of those captives was a man named Lot. Lot was the nephew of Abraham. When news reached Abraham that his relative had been taken, He made a decision that would become one of the most dramatic rescue stories in the early biblical narrative. Instead of accepting defeat, Abraham gathered a small group of trained men from his household. The number was surprisingly small, just over 300. Against them stood a coalition of kings with far larger forces. Yet, according to the story, Abraham pursued them during the night and launched a surprise attack. The coalition was defeated, Lot was rescued, and the captives were freed. For many readers, this moment represents something deeper than a simple battle. It shows the theme that appears again and again throughout biblical history. Power alone does not determine the outcome of events. Sometimes the unexpected happens. Sometimes small groups change the course of history. And sometimes the nations that appear strongest in one generation fade away in the next. Because history is always moving. Empires rise, empires fall, and new powers eventually take their place. Over the centuries that followed, the small kingdoms connected to Elam and the Medes continued to grow in influence. Trade networks expanded across the ancient world. Armies became larger, cities became wealthier, and slowly the political map of the region began to shift. But the real turning point came many generations later, a moment when two powerful cultures, the Medes and the Persians, would unite, and together they would form one of the most influential empires the world had ever seen, the Persian Empire. Under the leadership of remarkable rulers, this empire expanded rapidly. From the mountains of Central Asia, to the borders of Egypt, to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, the Persian Empire became one of the largest political powers of the ancient world. Yet what makes Persia especially interesting in the biblical story is not simply its military power. It is the role it played in one of the most surprising moments in Jewish history. Because unlike many empires that conquered and destroyed Jerusalem, Persia would one day become the empire that helped restore it. And the story of how that happened began with a prophecy written long before the event itself. A prophecy that mentioned the name of a king long before he was even born. His name was Cyrus, and the events surrounding his rise would become one of the most fascinating intersections between ancient prophecy and recorded history. But to understand how Cyrus changed the destiny of an entire nation, we first need to look at what the prophets actually said, and why their words were considered so astonishing.
History sometimes moves slowly. Empires grow over centuries, power shifts gradually, and the rise of nations often feels like a slow turning of the wheel. But every once in a while, history changes almost overnight. A new leader appears, a new idea spreads, and suddenly the world begins to look very different. In the ancient world, one of those turning points came through a man whose name would eventually echo through both history books and biblical texts. His name was Cyrus the Great. Today, historians remember him as the founder of the Achaemenid Empire, one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. But what makes Cyrus especially fascinating is that his story does not only appear in history. His name also appears in the pages of the Bible. And according to the biblical narrative, his rise to power was not random. It had been mentioned long before he was even born. To understand how extraordinary this claim is, we need to step back for a moment and look at the world before Cyrus came to power. At that time, the Middle East was dominated by a powerful empire, the Empire of Babylonian Empire. Babylon was not just a city, it was a symbol of power, wealth, and authority. Massive walls surrounded it. Grand temples reached toward the sky.
Its rulers commanded armies that conquered vast territories across the region. One of the most famous rulers of Babylon was Nebuchadnezzar II. Under his rule, Babylon became one of the most magnificent cities in the ancient world. But his reign also marked one of the darkest chapters in the history of Jerusalem. In the 6th century BCE, Babylon conquered the kingdom of Judah. The city of Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple was burned, and thousands of people were taken far away from their homeland into exile in Babylon. For the Jewish people, it felt like the end of everything. Their city was gone, their temple was gone, their nation had collapsed. Many believed they would never return home again. And yet, during that time of exile, something remarkable began to circulate among the people: a prophecy. The prophecy came from the writings of Isaiah. What made this prophecy astonishing was that it mentioned a specific name, a name that at the time the prophecy was written belonged to someone who had not yet appeared on the world stage. The name was Cyrus. According to the text, this future ruler would play a role in allowing the Jewish people to return to their homeland and rebuild their temple. For generations, those words must have seemed mysterious. Who was Cyrus? When would he come? And how could a foreign king have anything to do with the future of Jerusalem? At the time the prophecy was written, Babylon seemed unstoppable. Its power stretched across the region. No one imagined that its dominance could disappear so quickly. But history was already moving toward a turning point. Far to the east, in the lands of Persia, a young leader was beginning to rise. Cyrus was not born into the most powerful empire of the time. Instead, he emerged from the Persian people, who were initially under the influence of another regional power, the Medes. Yet Cyrus proved to be an extraordinary strategist and leader. Through alliances, military campaigns, and political wisdom, he gradually unified the Persian and Median forces. And once that unity was established, the balance of power in the ancient world began to shift. City after city fell under his influence. Kingdom after kingdom joined the expanding Persian realm. The growing power of Persia soon attracted the attention of Babylon, but Babylon still believed itself to be untouchable. After all, the city was legendary for its defenses. Ancient writers describe walls so wide that chariots could race along the top. The city was surrounded by fortifications, towers, and gates, and perhaps most importantly, the Euphrates River flowed directly through the heart of the city, providing water and additional protection. To the Babylonians, it seemed impossible that anyone could capture their capital. Yet in the year 539 BCE, something extraordinary happened. The armies of Cyrus approached Babylon. But instead of launching a direct assault against its massive walls, Cyrus used a strategy that surprised everyone. According to ancient historians, Persian forces diverted the flow of the Euphrates River. As the water level dropped, soldiers were able to enter the city through areas that had previously been protected by the river itself. At the same time, the city was reportedly unprepared for a major attack. Some historical accounts even suggest that parts of the city were celebrating during the night the Persians entered. And by the time the full reality of what was happening became clear, it was too late. Babylon had fallen. The empire that once seemed unstoppable had been defeated, and the new ruler of the region was Cyrus. For many people living at that time, the fall of Babylon must have felt like a shocking moment. Empires that dominate the world for generations often appear permanent. Yet history repeatedly shows that even the greatest powers can disappear almost overnight. But the story of Cyrus does not end with military conquest. In fact, what happened next is one of the reasons he is remembered differently from many other ancient conquerors. Instead of ruling through fear and
From Persia
destruction,
and the Middle East,
Cyrus
ideas and
introduced
cultures spread
policies
across
that were
continents,
unusually
connecting
tolerant
ancient
for his
civilizations
time.
in a global
He
exchange of
allowed many
knowledge.
displaced peoples within the Babylonian Empire to return to their homelands. He encouraged the rebuilding of local temples, and among the groups who benefited from this policy were the Jewish exiles living in Babylon. According to the biblical account, Cyrus issued a decree allowing them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. After decades of exile, the door to return home had finally opened. For the Jewish community, this moment must have felt almost unbelievable. The empire that had destroyed their city had fallen, and the new ruler was not preventing them from rebuilding it. Instead, he was supporting it. For many believers, this moment was seen as a fulfillment of the prophecy written generations earlier. The name Cyrus, once just a mysterious reference in an ancient text, had now become a central figure in real historical events. But the story of Persia in the biblical narrative does not stop here. In the centuries that followed, the Persian Empire would continue to shape the course of history in surprising ways. Within its vast territories, many different cultures and peoples lived side by side. Among them were the Jewish communities who had returned to Jerusalem, and others who remained scattered across the empire. And within that world, another dramatic story would unfold. A story involving a young Jewish woman who rose to an unexpected position of influence within the Persian royal court. Her name was Esther, and the events surrounding her life would become one of the most dramatic rescue stories ever recorded in the Bible. But before we explore Esther's story, there is another mystery connected to Persia that would appear centuries later. A moment that took place not in the halls of a Persian palace, but in a small town in Judea. A moment involving travelers from the east, wise men who followed a star, and whose journey would eventually lead them to the birthplace of Jesus Christ. Who were these travelers? Where did they come from? And why were they searching for a newborn king? Some historians believe the answer may once again lead back to the ancient lands of Persia. And that possibility opens another fascinating chapter in the story.
The Persian Empire was unlike anything the ancient world had seen before. Stretching across enormous distances, it connected dozens of cultures, languages, and traditions under one political system. From the mountains of Central Asia to the deserts of Egypt, from the shores of the Mediterranean to the valleys of Mesopotamia, the empire ruled over millions of people. At its height, the Persian court became one of the most powerful centers of authority on earth. Among the rulers of this vast empire was a king known in the Bible as Xerxes I. He ruled during a time when the Persian Empire was wealthy, confident, and enormously influential. His royal capital included magnificent cities such as Susa, a place filled with grand halls, decorated palaces, and elaborate gardens. According to historical descriptions, Persian kings lived surrounded by extraordinary luxury. Massive columns supported palace roofs. Walls were decorated with colorful glazed bricks. Courtyards held ceremonies where ambassadors from distant lands arrived bringing gifts and tribute. But behind the beauty of the royal court, political tensions were always present. Powerful advisors competed for influence. Nobles formed alliances, and decisions made inside the palace could affect millions of people across the empire. It was within this world that one of the most dramatic stories in the biblical narrative begins, the story of a young Jewish woman named Esther. Esther lived during a time when many Jewish families were still scattered throughout the Persian Empire. Some had returned to Jerusalem after the decree of Cyrus the Great,
but many others remained in cities across Persia, building new lives while preserving their traditions. Esther was one of those who lived within the empire. She had been raised by her cousin, Mordecai, who served in a position connected to the royal administration. Neither of them could have imagined how dramatically their lives would soon change. The story begins with an event inside the royal court. King Xerxes held a great celebration for his officials and nobles. For many days, the palace was filled with feasts, music, and displays of royal wealth. But during this celebration, something unexpected happened. The queen at that time, known as Vashti, refused to appear when summoned by the king. The reasons behind her refusal remain debated by historians and scholars. What we do know is that the refusal created a serious problem for the royal court. The king's advisors feared that if the queen openly disobeyed the king, it might encourage similar behavior throughout the empire. As a result, Queen Vashti was removed from her position. Soon after, the palace began searching for a new queen. Young women from across the empire were brought to the royal court. They went through months of preparation before appearing before the king. Among those chosen was Esther. At this time, the king did not know that Esther was Jewish. Her identity remained hidden, following the advice of Mordecai. When Esther finally appeared before the king, the narrative describes something remarkable. Out of all the women presented, she found special favor in his eyes, and in time she was crowned Queen of Persia. For a young woman who had once lived quietly within a minority community, the change must have felt extraordinary. Suddenly she was living inside the most powerful palace in the world. Yet her position would soon become far more significant than anyone expected. Because at that same time, another powerful figure within the royal court was rising in influence, a man named Haman. Haman held a high position among the king's advisors. He enjoyed authority, prestige, and the respect of many officials. But the story tells us that Haman's pride eventually led him toward a dangerous decision. At one point, he encountered Mordecai at the royal gate. While others bowed in respect to Haman, Mordecai refused. The reasons behind Mordecai's refusal are interpreted in different ways by scholars. But whatever the motivation, the refusal deeply offended Haman. His anger did not stop with Mordecai alone. Instead, he began plotting something far extreme. Haman devised a plan to destroy the entire Jewish population living throughout the Persian Empire. To carry out this plan, he approached King Xerxes with a proposal. He described a group of people scattered throughout the empire who followed different customs and laws. He suggested that allowing them to remain could create problems for the stability of the kingdom. The king, unaware that his own queen belonged to this very group, approved the decree. Official letters were sent throughout the empire announcing the decision. For Jewish communities across Persia, the news must have been terrifying. An empire that stretched across vast lands had now issued an order threatening their very survival. When Mordecai learned about the decree, he was devastated. He sent word to Queen Esther, urging her to act. But Esther faced a serious dilemma. Approaching the king without being summoned was dangerous. Persian law could punish such an action severely. Yet Mordecai sent her a message that would become one of the most powerful lines in the entire story. He suggested that perhaps she had come to her royal position for such a time as this. Those words carried enormous weight. They implied her unexpected rise to the throne might not have been random. Instead, it might have placed her exactly where she needed to be at the moment her people needed help the most. Esther made a courageous decision. Before taking action, she asked the Jewish community to join her in a period of fasting. For several days, they prepared themselves spiritually. Then Esther approached the king. According to the story, the moment was tense. If the king rejected her approach, the consequences could be severe. But instead, the king extended his golden scepter, a sign that she was welcome. Esther invited the king and Haman to a special banquet, then another, and during the second gathering, she finally revealed the truth. She told the king about the decree that threatened her people. She explained that she herself belonged to the very group targeted by Haman's plan. The king was shocked. In that moment, the powerful advisor he had trusted was suddenly exposed as the architect of a terrible plot. The story reaches a dramatic turning point. Haman's scheme collapses. The decree is reversed through a new royal order allowing Jewish communities to defend themselves, and the crisis that once threatened their survival turns into a moment of deliverance. For generations afterwards, the Jewish people would remember these events through a festival known as Purim. Even today, this celebration recalls the story of courage, hidden identity, and unexpected rescue. But the story of Persia's connection to biblical history does not end there. Centuries later, the Persian world would once again appear in a moment that changed history. This time, the setting was not a royal palace. It was a small town called Bethlehem, and the characters involved were travelers from the East. Scholars often refer to them as the Magi. According to the account in the Gospel of Matthew, these travelers followed an unusual star across great distances. Their journey eventually led them to the place where a child had been born. That child was Jesus Christ. Many historians have suggested that the Magi may have come from regions connected to the Persian cultural world. If that possibility is true, it means the lands once ruled by Persian Empire may have played a role in recognizing one of the most significant moments in Christian history. And with that possibility, the long story connecting Persia and the biblical narrative continues. A story that stretches from ancient prophecies to royal courts to distant travelers following a star across the desert night. Yet even beyond these moments, the ancient lands once called Persia would continue shaping the story of the world for centuries to come. And the final chapter of this exploration may reveal something even more intriguing, because many readers believe certain prophetic passages may still point toward events that have yet to unfold.
By the time the story
But
reaches the first
understanding
century,
those ideas
the world had
requires
changed
careful
dramatically.
study
Empires
and a
had
look at
risen
how
and fallen.
history,
The
faith,
once dominant
and
Achaemenid
interpretation
Empire had
intersect.
eventually been conquered by
And
the
that
armies
is
of
where
Alexander
the
the
final
Great.
part of our
After
story
Alexander's
begins.
campaign swept across the ancient world, the political landscape of the Middle East shifted once again. Greek influence spread throughout the region. Cities were rebuilt with new cultural ideas. Trade routes connected distant civilizations more tightly than ever before. But even though political power had changed hands, the intellectual traditions of the Persian world did not simply disappear. In fact, in many regions they continued to flourish. Ancient Persia had long been known for its scholars, priests, and astronomers, people who studied the movements of the stars and tried to understand the patterns of the heavens. Among these learned groups were figures sometimes described as wise men or scholars. In Greek texts, they were often referred to as a magi. These magi were known for their study of astronomy, philosophy, and sacred traditions. They observed the skies carefully. They recorded unusual celestial events, and they believed that certain movements in the heavens could signal important moments in history. For centuries, these scholars had watched the stars from the eastern lands once connected to the Persian world. And according to one famous story recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, something unusual eventually appeared in the night sky, a star unlike the others. When these travelers noticed it, they believed it was announcing the birth of a king. Not just any king, a king whose arrival carried great significance. And so they began a journey. Their destination lay far to the west. Their path crossed deserts, mountains, and ancient trade routes. Eventually, they arrived in the region of Judea, where the Roman Empire held political control. At that time, the local ruler was Herod the Great. When the travelers reached Jerusalem, they asked a question that surprised everyone. They asked where they could find the newborn king of the Jews. The question immediately created tension inside the royal court. King Herod was already known for being deeply protective of his power. The idea that another king had been born was alarming, so he summoned religious scholars and advisors to understand what the visitors might be referring to. Those scholars turned to ancient writings. Among them were passages connected to the prophets of Israel. One prophecy suggested that a ruler would come from a small town called Bethlehem, and so the travelers continued their journey there. According to the account, they eventually found the child they had been seeking. That child was Jesus Christ. The Magi brought gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Each gift carried symbolic meaning in the ancient world. Gold was associated with kingship. Frankincense was often connected with sacred worship, and myrrh was used in burial rituals and medicinal practices. For many readers of the story, the moment carries deep symbolism. Travelers from distant lands recognizing the birth of a child who would later influence the course of global history. But historians have long asked an interesting question. Where exactly did these magi come from? The text itself simply describes them as coming from the east. However, many scholars have noted that the term magi was strongly associated with learned priestly groups connected to the ancient Persian world. If that interpretation is correct, it would mean that lands once ruled by Persian empires may have played a role in recognizing the birth of Jesus. And if we look back through history, that possibility becomes even more fascinating. Because centuries earlier, another figure connected to the Persian court had also been studying visions and prophecies. A man known in the Bible as Daniel. According to the biblical narrative, Daniel served in the courts of both Babylonian and Persian rulers. He was known for interpreting dreams and visions. Some traditions suggest that his writings may have circulated among scholars in the eastern regions long after his lifetime. If so, it raises an intriguing possibility. Perhaps knowledge of certain prophetic traditions traveled eastward over generations. Perhaps those traditions were studied by scholars in distant lands. And perhaps, when a strange star appeared in the sky centuries later, some of those scholars interpreted it through the lens of those earlier writings. Of course, historians continue to debate the exact details. But the idea highlights something remarkable. The connections between Persia and the biblical narrative stretch across centuries, from the decree of Cyrus the Great allowing exiles to return home, to the royal court of Xerxes I in the story of Esther, to the eastern scholars who traveled across the desert searching for a newborn king. Again and again, the lands once known as Persia appear in unexpected places within the story. But the influence of Persia did not stop with biblical events. Even after the classical era ended, the region continued to play an important role in world history. Over the centuries, new dynasties rose, new cultural traditions emerged, and Persia became a center of poetry, philosophy, and scientific discovery. Scholars translated ancient texts. Mathematicians developed new ideas. Astronomers continued studying the skies just as their predecessors had done thousands of years earlier. The region also became home to some of the most beautiful architectural achievements in the Middle East. Cities expanded with grand mosques, libraries, and schools. Poets wrote verses that are still admired around the world today. In many ways, Persia became a bridge between civilizations. Ideas from India, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean flowed through its cities. Trade routes connected distant regions. Knowledge passed from one generation to the next. And through it all, the ancient history of Persia remained deeply woven into the cultural memory of the region. Today, when people study the history of the ancient world, they often see Persia as one of the great civilizations that shaped the development of human society. Its rulers influenced politics. Its scholars influenced knowledge. Its stories influence religious traditions that continue to shape billions of lives today. And perhaps most fascinating of all is how often the Persian world appears in moments that seem to connect different eras of history together. Moments where ancient prophecies, historical events, and cultural traditions intersect. From the rise of powerful empires, to the courage of a queen who risked everything for her people, to travelers who crossed deserts guided by a star. Each moment adds another layer to a long and complex story. A story that reminds us how deeply connected human history truly is. And in the final part of this journey, we will explore one last question. Why do so many readers continue to revisit these ancient passages today? What lessons do they believe these stories still hold? And what do historians say about the lasting legacy of Persia in the modern world? Because sometimes the most interesting discoveries are not just about the past. Sometimes they help us understand how the past continues to shape the present. History rarely moves in straight lines. Civilizations rise with incredible energy, build cities, armies, and monuments, and then slowly fade as new generations take their place. Yet even when empires disappear, their influence often continues in ways people do not immediately notice. Few civilizations demonstrate this better than ancient Persia. The empire that began with the leadership of Cyrus the Great eventually became one of the most influential political systems the ancient world had ever seen. Its administrative ideas shaped how later empires governed large territories. Its road network connected distant regions, allowing trade and communication to move faster than before. And its policy of allowing diverse cultures and religions to exist within the empire created a model of governance that historians still discuss today. Although the Achaemenid Empire eventually fell to the campaigns of Alexander the Great, the cultural identity of Persia did not disappear. Instead, new dynasties emerged, new traditions blended with older ones, and the region continued to play an important role in the development of world civilization. Across the centuries that followed, Persian scholars contributed to mathematics, astronomy, medicine, literature, and philosophy. Cities once connected to ancient trade routes became centers of learning where knowledge from different cultures was preserved and shared. The Persian language itself produced some of the most admired poetry in history. Writers and thinkers explored themes of love, spirituality, justice, and the nature of human life. Their words traveled across borders and generations. Even today, those works are still studied and celebrated. But when historians examine the Persian world, they often notice something else. A recurring connection between this region and key moments described in biblical texts. The story begins with a decree of Cyrus the Great, which allowed Jewish communities to return to Jerusalem after years of exile. It continues with the dramatic events involving Esther, whose courage helped protect her people within the Persian royal court. Later, the influence of Persian intellectual traditions appears again in the account of the Magi, who traveled west following a mysterious star. And at the center of that story stands Jesus Christ, whose life would eventually influence billions of people across the world. When these moments are viewed together, they form a fascinating pattern. The Persian world repeatedly appears at key intersections between history and faith traditions, not always as the main focus of the story, but often as a powerful background for shaping events. For some readers, these connections are simply part of the historical landscape of the ancient Near East. For others, they carry deeper meaning. They see patterns of timing and influence that seem almost impossible to predict centuries in advance. Historians, theologians, and scholars continue to study these connections from many different perspectives, and each perspective adds another layer to the conversation. But perhaps the most important lesson that emerges from studying ancient Persia is not about prophecy or politics alone. It is about the surprising ways history unfolds. Think about the journey we have explored. A young leader rises in Persia and builds one of the largest empires of the ancient world. That empire allows displaced communities to return home and rebuild their city. Within its royal court, an unexpected queen risks a life to save her people. Centuries later, scholars from the eastern land travel across deserts searching for a newborn child. Each moment seems separate when viewed individually. Yet when placed together, they create a story that stretches across generations. A story about how cultures influence one another, about how ideas travel across borders, about how decisions made by one generation can shape the lives of many others. And perhaps that is why the history of Persia continues to fascinate people today, because it reminds us that the world has always been interconnected. The events in one region can ripple outward in ways no one expects. A decision made by a king, a courageous act by a young woman, a journey taken by travelers following the stars. Each small moment becomes part of a much larger story. And when historians look back thousands of years later, those moments help us understand how our modern world came to be. The lands once known as Persia are now part of the country called Iran. Its history stretches back thousands of years, connecting ancient civilizations to the modern era. Today, scholars, historians, and readers around the world continue exploring that long history, not just to understand the past, but to understand how the past continues shaping the present. Because every generation inherits the stories of those who came before. And sometimes those stories reveal connections we never expected to find. Connections between distant cultures, between ancient empires and modern nations, between historical events and the beliefs that continue to inspire people today. In the end, the story of Persia is not just a story of one empire. It is a story of how civilizations influence one another across time, a reminder that history is not only about wars and rulers. It is also about ideas, courage, faith, and the unexpected ways human lives intersect. And perhaps that is why these ancient stories are still being told today, not simply because they happened long ago, but because they continue to invite us to ask questions about the world, about history, and about the forces that shape our shared human journey.